At night, the giant stuck its eye through the hole through his television and watched him as he slept. He would go up against inanimate objects and always win emotionally, even though the inanimate objects won physically. He would always smile if he saw someone he recognized. It was never too long before he talked too much and said something stupid. He took this nighttime job flyering for music shows. The job was hatched out of the back of a fly-by van that would stop in front of his house. We keep saying, let's call him Morrison. Back of a fly-by van that would stop in front of Morrison's house. Morrison's funny little house with its two gables painted to look like the eyes of the giant, with its purple walls and yellow shingles. You'd grin if you saw it, and maybe murmur, cool. The van would toot, and Morrison would come out, knock on the back of the van, and the door would swing wide, and there'd be Pike, like the fish, as Pike would tell you, and Pike would be chewing half-heartedly away at a cigarette. Pike sat in a wound-up, hunched, utterly awkward position, probably on the wheel well of the van, for what Morrison could guess by his vantage point, and Pike was just about invisible in the universe of papers and notebooks and overstuffed cardboard boxes and building materials and wayward tools and television sets and outdated technologies that choked the van's back. Pike would rummage in a box and hand Morrison a teetering stack of 5 flyers, and Morrison would manage to snug the flyers between one hand and his hairless chin. Morrison would feel the glossiness of the top flyer at the tip of his chin. He'd smell the freshness of the minting of the flyers. They were always flyers for raves in warehouses, for where pillheads could go and eat pills and either dance all night or watch lights all night or knock to the beats all night, or maybe all 3 of those things. "All right, Pike?" Morrison would ask. "Yes, sir," Pike would respond, rummaging. Then, in the time it took for the flyers to be pulled from a box and handed over, Morrison would task himself to come up with one quick question about some other aspect of the van's contents, because, of course, the contents always fascinated. "What's with those bendy pipes?" Morrison would ask, for example, and Pike would respond one of 3 ways. He'd respond with obfuscation, "They're for another job," which meant the universe of the van's contents was in turn responsible for a universe of this and that. Or Pike would respond with a correction, "They're not bendable." Or Pike would respond with the actual answer, always adding some tantalizing yet mysterious detail, "They're for gunners at the channel shed." And then the flyers would be handed over, and Pike would give the same instruction, always the same instruction, "Only dole them out between midnight and 5 in the morning." Right. And then the van doors would swing shut and the van would drive away. Morrison would stand there wondering about the job's hours, wondering if the operation was just simply shy about firing, wondering how Pike made the van doors swing shut, without touching them, or Morrison would simply wonder what such things as the channel shed could possibly be, or Morrison with his free hand would snap his fingers in self-damnation at not asking what was always his biggest question after the van drove away. He'd then sing the short, tuneless song he'd made up in regards to the question. Oh, is he who drives that van, or is he even a man? Who is that driving that van? Does he drive by a coda, kicking at a can? He chucked that can of soda on the driver's side floor. Now it's in the way of the accelerator. Who is he who drives that van? And why do I always first think of him as a man? Anyway, Morrison would deliver the flyers at night. He thought of another van he and his friends had once captured in the countryside, and then they couldn't remember where they captured it. He drove a vehicle he thought was like a van, but much smaller. It could fit him and the flyers, and it did not run on gas. Thank God. He would always like to spot lonely soda cans sat lonely in empty parking spaces. He would always like the radio to waver between stations and the stations belting out, and then little interstices of static. The best time of this being the time the radio wavered between French people talking and early American banjo blues. Morrison pitched a tent in his yard so to avoid sleeping in front of the television and have the giant sticking an eye to the other side of the screen and go all night, keeping that eye on poor Morrison. But then Morrison was always reluctant to go outside and sleep in the tent because, after all, it wasn't a good night's sleep. But then again, neither was the midnight flyering gig, and creeping Morrison would go down this street, down that, prize when he found an apartment building with a stack of mailboxes, a pen in his pocket, a star in his eye, his heart chugging, his mother far away. The flyers went into mail slots. Every decent door had a mail slot. Mail slots could stand up straight, and those were difficult to shove a flyer through. Or a mail slot would be laying flat on the door but still have two opposing clusters of fibers beyond the squeaky mail slot threshold, and Morrison's hand would get tangled. But mostly, mail slots lay flat and were easy to feed. Morrison would slink along feeding the flyers. He was good at it. And the flyers, reconfigured from a stack between his palm and chin to a load in a small cloth canvas bag, would whisper into mail slot oblivion, oh so quickly. And Morrison might be done flyering by as early as 3 a.m. You remember how she had said, "Yes, but 2 hours soon become an endless series of lakes and waterfalls and mountains, and none of it anywhere, any home in sight." You remember how she would always be assisted by so many male clerks in, for example, the electrical department. You remember how she kept a red cushion stool in the fireplace instead of fires. You remember how she said she mostly just cried. You remember how she said she was the male version of Marjorie. You remember how her eyes went down toward her shoes when she no longer wanted to fight. Fat American watching the hawk-haired fella zipping up his blue jacket. Morrison remembered thinking whilst crossing the plaza just before his flyering job ended for good. Morrison arrived at the top of the streets and the lights had gone orange down it as far as he could see. The way they made you sad in the night, that orange. and one light way at the end of the street flickered, and Morrison moved to the first mail slot, and he flipped it, and flipped in a flyer, and seemed to see an eye in the entry hall of the house beyond the slot, a single eye watching out at him. And Morrison thought of his own eye looking back, and he thought of the two eyes of him as though he were outside himself looking at his two eyes looking. And he thought of the single eye of the other on the other side of the mail slot, and not making contact with his own eyes. He shook himself all over and moved to the next house and the next mail slot, and flicked it and chucked in a flyer. And he caught a glimpse for certain this time of just one eye beyond the mail slot watching out at him. What's with this street and everyone waiting for me behind their doors, he thought, and carried on and flipped the next mail slot at the next house and shoved a flyer through, and in dim green light through said mail slot he could see just simply one more eye watching out at him. And he hurried on, wondering why these watching, waiting eyes didn't belong to people who emerged from their houses to scold him for flyering, but no one emerged. Maybe they liked getting the flyers. He went to a fourth house, and there indeed another eye could be seen making eye contact with Morrison's own eye in the momentary glimpse through the door that the flick of the mail slot's own door allowed. Have I finally flyered too much? Flyered every possible house in the city, and now they've conspired and are awaiting me, and if so, why? They only seem to be watching. They don't emerge and pounce on my back as I hurry back down each walk. The fifth door was different. The mail slot was lower, and Morrison couldn't see through without hunching. He slid in a flyer, though, sticking his fingers well into the slot, and a yowl sounded from the far side of the door, and he felt a sizable talon rend his index finger, a hot sort of pain. And Morrison jerked his fingers out of the slot. The yowl shifted to a growl. Morrison looked at his index finger. The top knuckle was sliced wide and splayed like a top joint of an index finger-sized fish filleted. Ow, said Morrison, and with blood pouring, he lifted the flap again, but only with the index finger's fingernail, and he crouched and peered through. The creature was in the entryway beyond, lit rose and prancing with territorial anger, its gills vented, its back up, its silver fur up, its scaled tail tip carving a million quick small circles. Morrison let down the flap. He watched his finger drip. It would surely need stitches. Morrison decided to quit the flyering job right then. The hours were bad, and the walk swirl was dangerous in various ways. In fact, the only positive slice of the job Morrison could think of was Pike and his mystery van, and Morrison was accustomed to that mystery now and would soon even grow bored of it. He dumped the rest of the flyers into a nearby recycling bin. The next day, he didn't go out to meet Pike in the van. Pike had once said, "If you don't come out to meet me even once, I'll assume you're quitting and I'll never show up again." True to his word, old Pike, it turned out. Morrison soon got a day job stuffing envelopes. It was a wisp of a job, but it tired him. He would fall asleep in the early evenings with the television running, and he would sleep unstoppably, unceasingly. And no matter whatever channel would go off air in the wee hours, the giant would come and stick its eye to the other side of the television screen and watch